to review opportunities for resource disaggregation and is designed for photonically resource disaggregated racks. Okay, so let's welcome George. Thanks.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm going to present our work in the last few years on digital computation in cryo-cooled environments. And the one particular project I'm going to be representing here is funded by the Army Research Office, and it's joint between us at LPL and UC Santa Barbara. You see key participants in this. It was a 3-year project, started in 2019. There's a lot going on. I'm going to try to give the broad highlights and broad overview of some of the most relevant topics, but there's a lot more going on. I'm happy to talk about offline. And we have the really successful team, and thanks to all of them making the project successful. So a little bit of background. There was this vision a few years ago on how to replace an HPC system, in this case Titan was at the time, with cryogenic computing, with an equivalent system, but in cryogenic temperatures. And this is what the goals were at the time. Let me see if I can get a cursor. So the goal was to get about the same performance. So Titan at the time had 17.6 petaflops. The target was 20, about the same. The memory, as you can see, scaled down a lot, scaled up from terabytes to petabytes. The power would have gone down a lot, and that is one of the benefits of this computation, of this environment, rather, that switching is a lot less expensive in terms of power. There's some caveats there, but we'll talk about that. And of course, the system itself is much smaller. You can see for perspective the size of a tile, a 2x2 standard in the systems. You can see a person who, I don't know if you can recognize, but that's back then former President Obama. He was. I think he led in it. I forget the distributive name, but you know, that's when the vision existed. That's when the vision started. Now, of course, cryogenic computing did not start then. There was a lot more research and investments in the previous millennium, in the 90s, and even before that. You can find some seminal papers in more countries. This is not just a US effort. Currently, there are China, Japan, Europe, Russia. They're all looking into a lot of these different aspects. But there's also a lot going on at the US, and it's all based on this observation that was made a long time ago. So this graph shows the resistance of metals on the y-axis, temperature on the x-axis. A standard metal, a non-superconducting metal, is going to have its resistance increasing with temperature. A superconducting metal has the same behavior, but only above a certain temperature. That's sort of the critical temperature. And below the temperature, it has zero resistance. So that observation was made a long time ago, and folks said, okay, well, zero resistance. Well, we can compute really fast with no power. So let's take advantage of that. Now, there's also a lot of research related to this going on how, what materials have what behavior. The temperatures I'm going to be talking about today are usually 4 Kelvin. That's where sort of the standard RSFQ technologies are assume at, but there is a lot of research that tries to have superconducting behavior in higher temperatures, and that's going to make, of course, cooling a lot easier. But just have in mind that a lot of what I'm talking about today is 4 Kelvin. Now, this is not take a chip and let's freeze it. The underlying technology at what I'm talking about is also a lot different. We don't have the transistors we used to seeing. We have these other devices called Josephson junctions. And Josephson junctions, there's a lot of physics going on here, but I'm going to abstract it. At a high level, a Josephson junction is basically a device that has 2 superconducting ends separated by an insulating barrier. Now, what's really interesting about this device is that it has sort of 2 modes of operation. It has a superconducting and a resistive mode. So when you pass current through it, and that current is below a threshold current, below threshold current, that the current goes through with no resistance. That's the superconductive state. When the current exceeds that critical value, that critical current, there we go, the device jumps to the resistive state and actually has resistance with more current. And then again, when the current drops below another value, it goes back to the superconducting state. which is a really interesting behavior. So the goal here is to build logic and to compute using that behavior. But it's not just these two modes. When the device switches from superconducting to resistive, it emits a pulse. And that pulse is millikelvins, it lasts just a few picoseconds, it's a small pulse, it's observable. And that is sort of the fundamental unit where we represent behavior in this logic. And that pulse is quick, speed of light. And so we can have really fast data movement. This waveform here is observed from our simulations from SPICE. You can see this is just one example, of course, it depends on how you configure the device. But as you can see, it lasts a few picoseconds. In this case, it goes only up to 1.2 millivolts. So, pretty small. And this is the standard JJ symbol. There's another way to, there's another symbol I've seen for JJs that has like two little eyes, it makes it look like an angry bird. But this is the standard X that many publications use. So if we want to build logic, and let's say we want to implement like an AND gate using this abstraction, the speed of light, these pulses, it's, we have to do something more. So if we want to build an AND gate, and as a reminder, an AND gate has two inputs in this case, and it has to produce an output if it observes pulses or inputs in both of its inputs. The problem with these pulses is that they come and go. So on the right, I showed the equivalent AND gate in CMOS. And CMOS, as you can see, both inputs A and B, they maintain their state, their voltage for a certain period of time. Usually it's a clock pulse, and until the next clock edge. But that means that in CMOS, the input is stateful. It has its state, the gate can wait, can just observe the inputs at any time and produce an output. In the equivalent behavior on the left, input A sees a pulse, but it's so hard to align and synchronize pulses that we don't count on that. Therefore, by the time B arrives, A is gone. Oops. Which means that the gate has to remember that it observed A. And then likewise, when B comes, it knows it needs to produce an output. Now, the standard binary gates in RSFQ are clocked, exactly to make synchronization at every step easy. So there's a clock input, which is unusual if you think of CMOS. So when the clock input arrives, the gate is going to produce an output. So this is how do we implement these gates? Very simple. Another basic structure in this technology is what's called a SQUID, a superconducting inverse device loop. I think not great with expansion, but SQUID is always what we call it, which basically is it's a loop where current goes round and round. You can have one JJ like I'm showing here, but you can have multiple. And the JJs are there to switch and do actual useful compute, but also to maintain state. So how do we build a simple inverter out of this basic idea? So the inverter symbol is shown on the bottom right. It's the same as CMOS, but again, it has a clock input for the reasons that we explained before, but with an AND gate. So this is how you build an inverter. So these red X's are JJs. There's an inductance here and the JTLs. JTLs are basically delay elements. They're also used to strengthen the pulses that are coming in. So at the high level, what's going on is, remember, we want to respect how an inverter behaves. So an inverter, if it does not observe an input here on the data input, when the clock arrives, it has to produce an output. So how that works is, in the initial state, the inverter has this loop, this circulating current going through it. When the clock pulse arrives, that combines with the lock current and switches this JJ down here to the resistive state, which also makes it produce a pulse, and that pulse is the output pulse. I know there are many details here going on. It also has to do with how you configure these JJs and everything, but again, I'm trying to stay at a high level. And then the alternative mode of operation is, if we observe a data input, that pulse inverts the direction of the circulating current, so that when the clock pulse arrives later, it switches back the current, but it does not produce an output pulse. So we get the expected behavior. And in fact, there's a very well-known SUNY library that basically implements all the binary gates that we used to seeing in RSFQ, basically with these principles as I showed you. So you can get like AND gates, OR gates, and some of them are larger, some of them are more complicated, but this is like the basic idea behind them. So scaling up. A lot of the work that has gone into this superconducting technology, and by the way, the logic family that I'm talking about here is what's predominantly used today, not the only one, and that's called RSFQ, Rapid Single Flux Quantum Technology. And a lot of the implementations that we've seen are what I call here is CMOS inspired, which is really, let's take the architectures that we implement in CMOS, sort of copy paste, because the gates are the same, on source, and so on. We can put them in RSFQ, and they work. But we have to remember that this technology right now, the device density is to the order like 10 times less than CMOS right now. Area is at a premium. We cannot, in other words, we cannot feed many of these devices, these JJs, in chips. So this is one example here. This is a paper 2019, demonstrated chip, 48 gigahertz. Remember the speed motivation. So it's a multiplier. So it's a really fast multiplier, 8-bit inputs, 16-bit output. It uses 17,000 JJs, and it fits in one chip. So you get one 8-bit multiplier in one chip, thanks to the device density. And the chips, I mean, especially this was a test chip, so it couldn't be large. But also what I'm trying to explain here is that just copy and pasting for CMOS does not produce the most optimal result. It works, but it's not the most optimal. And here's another example, another demonstrated prototype, 14 millimeters square for one processing element of a neural processing unit. And I remember, yeah, and it was a 4-bit as well. So it's a really small element, fits, but area is a big deal. So if we want to sort of scale up even more and figure out how do we compare this technology library, RSFQ, or actually, yeah, Josephson junction-based computing with CMOS, even with cooling, energy is better. So, of course, the numbers depend on the computation that we perform, but it can be 10 to 100x. The operating frequency is higher, 5 times. You saw 50 gigahertz. We can get CMOS at 5 gigahertz today, so yeah, about 5 times. But the device density is one of the big problems. So that's where we're hoping that manufacturing is going to help. But what we do as computer architects here is we try to change the computation model to make the device density less of a problem by giving up small portions of what this technology is good at, like energy and frequency. So this is the segue to temporal computing, which is what the computation model is based on. And one way to do temporal computing is race logic, and that's what we've adopted in this technology. So how this works is, this is a way to represent information in the time domain. So we take time, and I'm going to show this representation in a future slides as well. Basically, we have the time axis, it goes from left to right, and we divide time in epochs. Epochs repeat, so there's another epoch after the one I'm showing, but in between epochs, everything resets or sort of starts all over again. Now, we have epochs. Inside the epoch, we have time slots. You can call them, however you want, but basically the idea is we divide the time inside an epoch, and for each of these time slots, we assign a value, a number. And now, remember where I said we represent data in the time domain. Now it's the time of arrival of a pulse that tells us the value. So if we have a pulse showing up at time slot number 1, that means that pulse represents the number 1. If we have a pulse at time slot 4, it represents number 4. Now you can already see some of the trade-off I'm talking about here. This is already much smaller than the binary equivalent, because to represent, like, for example, 16 values, here, we can do this with 1 wire. Binary needs 4 wires, and therefore many more JJs. So this, we can already see that it's going to result in much smaller circuits. The downside is that now the epochs have to be prolonged, so it's going to take longer. But this technology is already fast, so we can give up some of that. All right, so around this race logic, we have to adapt our gate library, because now some of the operations that were easy at CMOS are hard. But also some of operations that were hard at CMOS are now easy. One of those that is now easy is the min function. So I have 2 inputs, two data values, and I want to keep the minimum, the smallest of the two. With two race logic pulses, it's really easy. The minimum is the first one that shows up. So the behavior that we want is basically, this is a spice simulation, but basically the top two rows are the data inputs. You see here, the minimum is, so this gate is called the first arrival gate. It essentially is the minimum function. And it's called first arrival because the first of the two data pulses that arrive make it produce an output, but the second one does not. This is the state diagram, but it just implements the idea that I just talked about. And what's interesting about this gate library that I'm not going to talk about is that we didn't actually have to implement cells from scratch. We just repurposed cells that SUNY and other known binary focus libraries for RSFQ have already. So in this case, it's a DFF, it's a D flip-flop, but we use its clock input differently. No need to worry about that level of detail yet, but just remember the functionality of the gate and that it's easy to implement using existing cells. We didn't have to do a lot of hard work here. So minimum, there's also a maximum, two inputs. The second one that arrives produces an output. And that tells us that the maximum out of two input values. Now, I'm only showing two, you could have more. You could build a tree out of these things. State diagram, and just to finish up the library, the JTLs that I showed earlier, they're basically transmission lines that create a fixed delay from input to output. They delay a pulse. For our arithmetic, what that does is basically is an addition. So if we delay a pulse by 2 time slots, we're basically adding the number 2 to that pulse. So JTLs that are fundamental units that also are there to regenerate pulses, they do that for us, but it has to be with a fixed value. And the inverter that I showed you earlier is an actual gate. It's called the inhibit gate. And the inhibit gate has one control input. In this diagram, it's the top one, has one data input, it's the middle one. Anytime the input arrives, an input pulse arrives, it gets propagated to the output, unless we have an inhibit pulse into the gate's control input arrive before. So it's a way to sort of control the propagation of output pulses, and it is also useful for the algebra abstraction that we build around race logic. So that's sort of the fundamentals. Now, using this technology, using this abstraction, we were able to build some really cool things. Basically, this is one. It was led by Dilip. There's a cool paper about it, and it's a really interesting and clever idea. So you see here, the binary multiplier is on the left. Standard, in this case, it's 4-bit, 7-bit output. If we change that abstraction and basically make every input be divided by decimal digits, so basically we can now represent, in this case, we have 2 digits. Each digit is decimal, it's not hex, it's not binary anymore. So and by decimal, I mean it can range from 0 to 9, and we can have multiple digits, so we can construct any number with decimal digits, just like we do when we write in a piece of paper. So we can have these inputs, in this case, 2 decimal digits each, 4 decimal digits on the output. And what it does is it reduces the area to about half. And it's based on a really nice idea inside using lookup tables. And we can also save a lot of pin count. So another thing I didn't go into much before, but also these chips, partly because they're small and device density is so unfavorable, many of these chips are pin limited. So if we can come up with a new abstraction that reduces the number of pins that we require to do computation, that's also helpful. And that's also what this is doing here. So we can reduce pins by 2, to this example, at the inputs and so on. And this multiplier keeps the same interface, or an interface that can be converted to the equivalent binary multiplier interface. So we can just copy paste and drop it in. Another interesting project, this one is led by Kylie. And so this is now trying to implement machine learning using RSFQ and some of the principles that we talk about, race logic and pulse strips. This one is based on hyperdimensional computing. And hyperdimensional computing, not going to go into all the details, but basically the basic idea is that it represents elements as really long vectors. They can be 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 long vectors. Each element in the vector in this case, it's a 0 or 1. And that fits perfectly our abstraction because 0 is a pulse did not arrive, 1 is a pulse did arrive. You know, a pulse, the presence or absence of a pulse is basically binary information. It's a binary digit. It's the fundamental abstraction. So how this works is there are memory vectors that are stored inside the circuit. This is what the circuit has learned so far with online learning. This is the query vector that comes from the outside and is asking to be classified into a class that the circuit has learned. And so this, the fundamental operation here is that it calculates the difference vector, which is the difference between the class, or each class, but I'm only showing you one here, and the query vector. Gets a distance, the smallest wins. And this does, in terms of power, so this is not based on a chip, this is based on simulations, but you know, they're spicy level models, so you know, we feel good about them. So I'm showing here different columns for different vector lengths. The combined power, even for the largest vector length, is 7 milliwatts. It's not a lot. And we can get, so this is the bottom table now is performance. So at the very bottom is basically how many of these operations, queries, and online learning I can do. So again, focusing on the 10,000 vector length case, it's 3 mega, so 3 million, basically, over 3,200,000 operations. Okay. So we talked about race logic, we talked about some things we did with that idea, but then we wanted to, you know, further our goal here, which is to reduce area to make everything more efficient. And so we're sort of asking ourselves, okay, so race logic is great, but maybe we can combine it with something else to make the end result even better. So, and in particular, one thing that was sort of, you know, in our target is arithmetic, multiplication and addition. We wanted to make that simpler, cheaper, you know, smaller area. So we wanted, in this case, I'm showing you multiplication. We wanted to make multiplication smaller. So this is one example of how multiplication would work with race logic operands, both operands being race logic. So I have a race logic operand that has a value of 2. It's multiplied by another value of 2. We want the result to be 4. This is not an easy thing if we just stick with pure race logic, but it becomes much easier by changing a little bit our data representation. And by the way, I showed you race logic in integers. So basically, we divide our time slots, and the values of the time slots are 1 to n. It doesn't have to be that way. We can also change the representation to be fractions. So we can, using terms from stochastic computing, we can change them to unipolar representation. So now the range is 0 to 1. And we can have floating point numbers. And of course, if I have more time slots, I can have more floating point numbers in that range. So I could basically increase my precision. So that's unipolar. And I can also have bipolar, which is -1 to 1. And now I can have floating point numbers and negative numbers. But unless I change, increase my time slots, notice that I gave up some precision here. So we're changing race logic to work in unipolar and bipolar, either 0 to 1 or -1 to 1. So that's one operand type. The other operand type, again from stochastic computing, is pulse trains. And pulse trains now, the time of arrival of pulses doesn't matter. It's how many that tell us the value. We still have epochs because this all repeats. But basically, so in this example here, we have an epoch. If we observe the maximum number of pulses that we could have observed, so I mean, there's still time slots and there's maximum 1 pulse per time slot, that tells me the maximum value in my range, which in this case is 1. And if I have half the pulses, that tells me the half of the maximum value. So in this case, 0.5, I'm assuming the unipolar representation, 0 to 1, and a quarter, and so on. So now we change the semantics of our multiplication to be something like this. Again, we have epochs. We have a pulse that tells us, you know, the epoch began. This operand here, alpha, is a pulse train. The second operand, B, is race logic. So my pulse train operand has a value of 0.5 because I have half of the pulses. It's just an example, but in this example, it's 0.5. The race logic operand is 0.75 because the 1 pulse Remember, race logic will give you 1 pulse per epoch. The 1 pulse arrived 0.75. The key idea is we use that race logic operand to suppress any further pulses at the output. So before the race logic operand arrives, any pulse train operand from alpha would go to the output, as I'm showing here. As soon as the race logic pulse arrives, any further pulses at alpha do not get propagated to the output. And it works out. The result is a pulse train, but it has the correct value with these formatting assumptions and this value range. So why did we do this? Why did we want to complicate our lives? Well, because now, if we want to do multiplication, as I showed you in the unipolar range, now we can do this with just 1 cell. Remember earlier I showed you, hey, a binary multiplier uses 17,000 JJs. This one uses 15, 12. So we can do this with just 1 cell. And that it's 12 or 15, it's somewhere in that range. It's basically however many JJs that single cell has. It's an NDRO, it's a very commonly used cell. If we want to do multiplication in the bipolar range, -1 to 1, now we need 2 NDROs and a merger and an inverter. That brings it up to 50 JJs. Again, it's much smaller. So this is multiplication. To do addition, remember the output of this multiplication is a pulse train, and if we have many of these, to add multiple pulse trains, we just merge them into a single output. So we have 4 inputs, they all have pulse trains. If we merge them to single, that performs the addition because it preserves the count. Now, of course, there's a little bit of caveat how you do it. The cheapest way of doing it is as I showed here, with single, where every dot is a single merge cell. That works. But if you have 2 pulses that come in at the same time, one of them might get dropped, so we will have a little bit loss of accuracy. For a lot of what we do, that is fine. But for other cases, we have designed a counting network that actually preserves that. So anyway, we have a solution for that. But basically, if we use the multiplier that I showed you in the previous slide and this counting network to do the addition, now we have a multiplier accumulate arithmetic function unit. A really small one too. You know, and what's interesting about this multiplier, so let's compare it to a binary one for a second. So this is a graph that shows you latency in the y-axis. The y-axis is logarithmic, and bit count, this is the equivalent bit count of the operators. Both input, both input operators. Now, as we increase the number of bits, the latency for the unary, that's the one that I showed you, increases exponentially. And it makes sense because we have to go, if we go from 4 to 5 bits, for example, now we have twice as many time slots. So it takes twice as long to have an epoch, and each epoch produces 1 output. So that makes sense. The binary multiplier does get a little slower just because, you know, the critical path gets longer and so on, but it's far from exponential. It's also sublinear, I think. So you can see that this multiplier really prefers to operate at lower bits. And for many applications, that's just fine. I'm going to show you a CNN. But let's stick with 8 bits, which is a pretty common bit width for many applications there. Our multiplier is 6 times slower. And by the way, these dots here are other binary multipliers that have been published before. This line here is our model. But this, the dots are demonstrated multipliers. So yeah, it's slower. But now I'm showing you a graph of the latency of the area. I'm sorry. Our multiplier remains at 50 JJs. That's for the bipolar one, and does not increase with the more bits. Remember, I said at the beginning, if we want more bits, we just have to prolong the epoch. The circuit itself does not get larger. But the binary multiplier does get larger. Not much, but it does get larger. If we again stick with the 8 bits, our multiplier is 370 times smaller. So yeah, it's 6 times slower, but it's 375 times smaller. This is clearly a good performance over area trade-off, and it's what has been motivating us. So using this multiply accumulate, we can build a FIR filter. The abstract notion of one is shown on the bottom left, and the schematic, high-level schematic of the circuit is on the top right. So an FIR filter has these are little memory elements, then it has multipliers, and it has accumulate. So it's a great fit for what we're doing here. The multipliers that the FIR needs are basically implemented in the multiplier bank. These are NDRO cells. This is what I showed you. The counting network does the addition out of all the outputs of the multipliers. We have race logic memory cells, and I call them race logic because they're customized to respect the delay from an epoch because it's temporal value. I'm not going to go into detail for that, but we have built some custom memory cells for race logic that preserve temporal information. And this bank of NDROs, this basically drives the inputs, the constant inputs rather, yeah, for this FIR. And compared to binary, now of course it depends on how the bit width of the operands and the tabs and so on, but we can get 28 to 98% fewer JJs compared to binary, much smaller. And it is because it uses pulse trains, it has some good properties for resilience. By the way, this work, everything I talked about, like the new way to do multiplication, and this was led by Patricia, some amazing work. This slide here shows a follow-on work led by Miriam, and it uses some of the same principles to do FFT. And the idea here, so this is the circuit diagram, these X's are multipliers, this plus are others, accumulators. The real part of the computation, so FFT uses twiddle factors and inputs, and each of them is a complex number. The real value is red, blue is imaginary, and the X, the input, is race logic formatted. The twiddle factors, the constants, are pulse streams. That's plenty for now, but this shows basically, this blown up diagram shows you one block, but we can make the FFT computation scale up using the butterfly structure. That is well known in the circuits, but it also makes us be able to scale up easily. So basically, we can implement FIR and FFT using much less area than binary, using the principles that I showed you before. And it's actually, those are really commonly used in signal processing. It's what we try to do with the instrumentation. I'm going to come back to that later, but yeah, so compared to equivalent binary, you can get 2 to 18 times more throughput per JJ. Again, performance over area is a key metric, and in some cases also lower latency. Now, Patricia also did some really good follow-on work. This is a paper it's going to be presented next month actually, and how to implement a convolutional neural network, a CNN, where, I mean, there are multiple ways to do it. I'm only showing you one example, but the idea is, let's have an array of processing elements, and each processing element has input features, output features, and weight buffers, standard CNN stuff. But each processing element, because of all the things I talked about, is much smaller. So how this compares to equivalent binary, I'm showing you two things here. So on the left y-axis is the number of PEs that our circuit needs to match the equivalent binary performance. And on the y-axis is area gain. So, and as you can see, the story is pretty similar. Like for say 4 bits, the lowest in this graph, our circuit is 30 times smaller, actually a little over that, but let's say 30 times smaller than the equivalent binary with the same performance. Yeah, it needs more PEs, but that's okay because each PE is smaller. For 8 bits, I actually don't remember the exact number. It's it's a little smaller. But we've done a lot of good work. Patricia and Kylie have done a lot of good work on how to make the 4-bit case work just fine with quantization and other CNN techniques. And well, anyway, more details in the paper, but that ended up to be a good result. Now, we've also done tape outs with our collaborators and MIT Lincoln Labs. Through that joint project, we were fortunate to be brought together. We've manufactured 7 chips. We've only tested 2, I think, because we manufactured most at the end and actually testing and fabricating, it takes a while. We're actually producing text vectors for one right now. One of the problems of this technology is that EDA tools are not mature, let's say. So a lot of this was made by hand using either cadres or open source tools. So on the left, I'm showing you a chip that has 5 small circuits and like small parts of FFT and FIR and some other things that I showed you just to have small scale demonstrations. And then on the right, this was led So the left was led by Darren, the right was led by Dilip. And you can see this is a really cool layout that Dilip did. This is the multiplier that I showed you earlier. This was made by hand using open source tools, so it's pretty impressive. So we're hoping to get some good test results back. So some thoughts. Why am I talking to this about this in the instrumentation seminar? We're developing the capability to move computation closer to cryosensors, to cryo instrumentation. As far as I understand, and I've talked with folks, a lot of the processing right now happens in the room temperature. So basically we get the pulse and information out of the cryo environment to the room temperature, and then we process it. We can do more things closer to the sensor. So what I've been talking about so far is predominantly based on at 4 Kelvin. We can move at the hundreds of millikelvin range. You know, that's also where qubits live, but also a lot of these cryosensors live at a temperature. Some things do change. So the circuits become more noisy, areas more premium. Also, the power budget is more tight to maintain that temperature. But a lot of what we talked about do apply, almost copy-paste, assuming we meet all these constraints, to the 100 millikelvin. So we have the capability to do a lot more digital computation right next to the cryosensors, or at least at 4 Kelvin, because that gives us more room, both power and area, than we were able to before. At 65 Kelvin, that's where cryo-CMOS predominantly lives. And cryo-CMOS is closer to, you know, good old CMOS that we're used to. We can use it many different ways. We can use it for processing, but we can also use it for memory because of, you know, the device density being poor at 4 Kelvin. We cannot have a lot of memory, but we can have a lot more memory at 65 Kelvin. And there's projects going on, and we have collaborated. We've talked to people in various universities who basically look at the cabling between these temperature environments. So with that improvement as well, we should be able to do a lot of cool things. And then superconducting digital computing is what I talked about. As a whole, that environment, actually our experience in this project showed us it's actually really beneficial to co-design the computational model with the underlying technology. So a lot of the work just took CMOS-inspired binary designs that, you know, they made them work, and they work and they're good. But if we understand the abstractions, how pulses work, how we can use pulses, because CMOS, room temperature CMOS doesn't have pulses, but we have them in RSFQ. If we build a computational model around it, you know, we can do a lot of cool things. The ecosystem is, well, let's call it under development. EDA tools, they're being developed. There was a good project that we're part of, but still they need a lot more time to mature. You know, think of how long it took the CMOS tools to mature. And then also manufacturing technology has ways to go, and cooling and everything. So it's an ecosystem that needs to come together. I didn't talk about refrigeration in this talk, it's not what we did, but there's also good work about making refrigeration less power expensive, because that's gonna make our power comparison versus CMOS more favorable. It's already mostly favorable, but it's gonna make it even better. List of publications, and interested and done a little early, but we have time for questions.
Okay, thanks. We have a small audience here. Any questions?
Start with the room.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
So, why do you say cryo-CMOS?
Repeat.
I'll repeat. Okay.
Yeah,
I think this room has microphones everywhere. How you are connected in the room?
we can repeat it. It's fine.
Yeah.
Why cryo-CMOS is 65 Kelvin? I mean, we have perfectly good cryo-CMOS at home.
That's the applications that I've seen predominantly. I'm aware that there's some ongoing work, and I'm not very well versed on the trade-off. I think I have a backup slide on that somewhere, but in any case,
Because basically with scale technologies, they work out of the box at 4 Kelvin. Of course, then have no resistance.
Right.
So, well, if you use the right metal, now you use aluminum, right? And
Right.
Component, but if you use the right metal, you could make CMOS with no resistance at 4 Kelvin.
Yeah.
I wonder, maybe that should be the correct comparison.
Okay, so that's a good point. I don't have a great answer because I don't know how they compare. I can say though that a lot of what we talked about, we applied it to RSFQ. There is race logic for CMOS. We can take the same idea, put it in a more CMOS environment, but then we have to compare CMOS like with everything, with the clock trees and everything compared to RSFQ, and I'm not sure how it compares. Let's talk further. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Thanks. And there's a question from Maxim.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for interesting presentation. I just want to comment, I mean, I work on superconducting magnet diagnostics, and we have a lot of sensors sitting on magnets at 4.2 Kelvin, which are measuring voltages, acoustic emission, magnetic field, and so forth. And I think we're definitely interested in having cryogenic electronics and cryogenic processing close to the sensors, especially the things which you were talking about FFT chips, for example, which can do cross-correlation analysis. That's something we're really interested in. But my question is, how robust are these things? Can they sit, let's say, in magnetic field environment, or what are the limits at which they can operate in terms of magnetic field and perhaps radiation, which can be encountered in real systems like that?
So at a high level, what I can say is that the pulse trains is pretty robust. Even if pulses get dropped or shifted or something, it doesn't really change the representation. I mean, there are edge cases, but for the most part, it's a pretty robust representation. For race logic, we have a perfect knob to make them robust by prolonging the epochs and the time slots. And that might be fine for many applications. As soon as we hit the performance requirements, we can just make the epochs as long as we need, as long as we meet the performance, and to make it more robust. What I would be interested to talk to you about is, well, that sounds like a great collaboration, but we also haven't found any reliable noise model, like an error model that we can inject into our circuits. Patricia did some of that for the FIR work and showed it's actually pretty robust. So I guess let's talk further.
No, that sounds definitely interesting, because we're using cryogenic MOSFETs for amplifiers and also for controlling currents at low temperatures down to 4 Kelvin. And definitely having cryogenic electronics which is based on superconductors is great, but the question is how you implement that and how you actually combine it with the existing electronics we have. So that's definitely something we can discuss further.
Yeah, exactly.
I can definitely email you offline. We can.
Yeah, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. I just did.
Thank you.
So please
Thanks.
email me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's see, any other questions? So if not, I have one question. So in the beginning, you showed this picture with Obama on it. Like, how far away is this technology from that scale? And you mentioned like you have many ways to mitigate the problem of, like, for example, the area problem, compactness.
Are you talking about the
comparable to current supercomputers?
The Titan slide? Yeah. Okay. That is a big question on like, okay, this is great. How do we use it? Recently, DOE released an accelerated funding opportunity with exact that question. So I don't think I can answer that right now, but I know that there are many folks who are thinking of this in the form of an accelerator. So no longer like a an entire system replacement, but sort of let's have some accelerators on the side, and they can be used just like other resources, and they're good at particular things like FIR, FFT. You want FFT? I'll send it to the cryo environment. There's a lot of interesting cryo sensors from DOE as well. Pretty much what we talked about. The problem with making this a fully usable programmable system is that it requires a lot of memory and data movement in and out of the fridge, and those are technologies that are under development. So it's hard to say, when they'll be good enough for wide deployment, and that's sort of why some people are thinking of this technology as an accelerator. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Question, Steve? I'm just going to lean over awkwardly. Yes. The race encoding that you're doing here, you talked about how obviously in the superconducting environment, these signals propagate incredibly fast. How are you dividing up? How are you able to actually process the signals in these different time slots if they are moving so fast? How can you even distinguish what time slot they're in? That's a naive question.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything happens fast. So clock periods and everything are pretty fast. What you're right, I didn't go into detail into that, but I did show a hint that there are some control pulses, like in this case, there is a pulse that signals the beginning of an epoch. And for many of our circuits, that pulse acts as a reset. So let's clear the state of all of our cells and start all over again. In some cases, there are pulses that distinguish time slots as well. They could be derivative of that epoch. So it can be a comparison, but you have to remember, we can do a lot of arithmetic without that. Like the first arrival, they don't need the pulse at every time slot. They just take two inputs and they produce an output. So we only do this, if I can call it synchronization, at boundaries, but not at every gate. And so it's kind of like wave pipelining, if you're familiar with the term at CMOS, which is basically the computation propagates as a wave, kind of asynchronously, but made so that it's sort of in sync with each other, but without a clock. And then it gets synchronized at boundaries every so often.
So controlling your path then is just really fundamental.
Yeah, and this is where, and this is why robustness, was a good question, because we can design our paths, but if one path ends up being slower, then we have to make up for it by just prolonging the epoch. And we've done some of our work. We did some analysis to figure out like how much, we can design a time slot to be the minimum length that works in a simulation, but that's not good enough. So in most of our cases, we actually prolonged it by 20, 30, 40% just to make it more robust. But those questions are better answered with layouts, and it's hard to make a large scale layout at the same by hand. Remember, we don't have good EDA tools.
Okay, so I guess that's the end of today, and let's thank our speakers. I want to encourage people to come in person for our next meeting. Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone.
So